am your host, Carolyn Solo, LCSW, EMDR therapist, and mom of 3 daughters. Thank you for joining me.
Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 89 of the Future Template Parent Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Carolyn Solo, LCSW, PhD, EMDR consultant, and mom of 3 daughters. Thank you as always for joining me. Today, I just wanted to share some brief thoughts on a recent training I took during the ever so delightful process of renewing my social work license and how it made me think a little bit about how EMDR intensives, how the training elements were relevant to EMDR intensives. So, if you are anything like me, you don't always get your CEUs done in a consistent and sort of spread out way to avoid scrambling during that last month your license is valid before it expires. That's what you would do if you were not like me. If you are like me, then your last month of licensure, which for me was February, may have looked a bit like mine did. 28 days of scrambling to finish 20 CEUs before my license expired. Oops. And guess what? I did it again. This is the second time I've done this to myself. But hey, maybe this next cycle I'll spread them out more. I've said that before, but people can change. But anyway, one of the requirements for social work licensure in the state of Pennsylvania is that 3 of your 30 CEUs required for licensure renewal must cover clinical ethics. Oftentimes, the trainings I've done to fulfill this requirement have been so boring. But I actually stumbled on one this time that was actually excellent, all about the ethics of terminating client relationships. The title of the training is Engaging in Ethical Termination and Avoiding Abandonment, presented by Diane Bigler, LCSW. I purchased the 3-hour training from cetrainingworkshops.com, and it was on-demand recorded training if you're interested in checking it out. I'm obviously not going to rehash the contents of the entire training, but I will say that part of what piqued my interest in it was that, over the years and in the past, I have terminated with clients. There's a couple of examples I can think of where the relationship with the client I didn't think was clinically effective and appropriate anymore for different reasons. And I felt that I wasn't able to provide good clinical care. But I did worry in those cases, even though I did my very best to, be ethical in the process, I did worry, like, had I abandoned those clients? So it was just something that piqued my interest. But it also, as I was going through the training, it got me thinking a lot about how offering EMDR intensives actually creates a structure for healthy and clinically appropriate termination of the client therapist relationship, and can limit many of the potential ethical pitfalls that this training discussed. So what I thought I'd just talk about for a few minutes today, not too long, but is the list of elements for an ethical and appropriate termination process as listed by this training, and how EMDR intensives provide all of these elements in a really beautiful and effective way. So I'm going to read these elements one by one. I believe there's 12 that the presenter included. And this was actually, she cited, I can't remember now, but she cited a book from which she pulled this list. It wasn't her own creation, but it was a book that she referred to throughout about termination that she says she teaches social work students, and she always has them read this book. Of course, I could look it up, but I'm not going to. But anyway, these are the 12 things that she says are elements of an ethical termination. So, therapist preparation for termination was the first one. Well, mindset-wise, of course, we are going into the intensive prepared for termination, right? In episode 85, I talked about ongoing work with EMDR intensive clients and how I navigate that. And one of the things I mentioned is that I never tell new intensive clients that ongoing work is a possibility, and I rarely offer it unless it feels very clinically appropriate and my schedule accommodates it. So I'm very prepared for the work to end as soon as the 15-hour intensive comes to a close. So I go into the client relationship with that expectation that it is only going to last a couple of weeks or a week, depending on how I structure the time. So I am very prepared, and I don't have to necessarily go through a decision-making process myself about is it time to terminate or not. The second element was prepare the client. And again, this goes along with what I just said. Clients don't expect otherwise. They expect the intensive to be 15 hours and be done. They come in with a totally different mindset. So they are aware that this is not a lengthy relationship. They know that this is going to be short term. They know that they're working on something very specific. And the workbook prepares them really well for that structure, the workbook that I talked about in the podcast episode last week. There's a before, like a before the intensive part of the workbook. There's a in the, like, while the intensive is going on part, and then there's the after part. And all of those pieces create this really beautiful structure that allows for the different phases of the work to happen very naturally, including termination and ending. And I talked about the workbook last week. Like I said, if you want your free copy, you can still get it. DM me on Instagram at Future Template Parent so I can get it to you. And in those after pages in particular, there's a lot about following up with clients, how to do that, how to make sure they have access to other providers for quality continuity of care, how to make sure that you contact those other providers as needed. All of those things are parts of ethical termination, and they're all baked into the way that I structure my intensive process. And the clients, I make sure the clients are extremely aware of how all these pieces of the process will be presented to them and how I will carry them out. So the next step listed is check in. So this refers to checking in with the client about how they are feeling about termination. This might not feel like it applies during an intensive, but it totally does. I always do a mini check-in at every break point in the intensive. So before lunch every single day, at the end of day one, prep for how they're going to feel, prep for day two, looking at like where we're going to be. At the end of day two, same thing as we're approaching day three, right? There's still going to be feelings and fears and anxieties that can come up about ending the intensive, about how they're feeling after the first day. I talk a lot about how a lot of stuff gets stirred up after that first day, and people can feel worse at the end of the first day instead of starting to feel better. Helping them process any anxieties about what comes after the intensive, and just, all the feelings that they're having throughout and how that might impact the overall progress of the intensive. So I do think that the client is going to have feelings about the intensive ending, and it's important to check in with them and to process them, consistently throughout. Like, there's always that line that I'm sure we've all heard of, like, you start talking about termination at the first session. In an intensive, yes, I do agree that should be something that we do, but in an intensive, it's baked in. Like, we have really tangible goals. We're not just sort of free floating through this whole thing, and we know where we're starting, and hopefully we have a sense about where we're ending. We definitely know when we're ending. So checking in with the client. Express appreciation is the next one. I always review the hard work that we've done with the client and emphasize what I have seen in them, the transformation I've seen in them, ask them to reflect on that, and thank them for how hard they've worked, right? I think that sometimes in longer therapeutic relationships, it can be harder to review progress because we've known someone for a really long time. We do maybe have to look back and be like, okay, where were they? Where are they now? In an intensive, the goals are very clear. The outcomes are very clear. So we can absolutely review progress and just talk about, wow, look what you did to get to where you are now versus where you were 15 hours ago. I highlight how impressive it is that they made such a profound and serious commitment to their own healing. The next one is discuss perceptions about change. So that could be change in terms of the relationship ending, which certainly, again, like I've said, we do talk to them about. It could also be perceptions about, do they think this change is sustainable? The changes they've seen, how might we help them plan to make this sustainable change? All that is important. Discuss thoughts and feelings about ending. And, this overlaps a bit with some of the stuff I've said before. I do think that in the training that I attended, where this list came from, checking in with a therapist and client, like I mentioned earlier on, did have to do with evaluating if ending is appropriate at this point, and if so, why. And although that's not as much of a consideration, I certainly think it's very important to be sure that the client has that ongoing support, and that if they're not already connected with another provider, that you make those referrals. Helping the client prepare for the transition. Again, the workbook does a great job of this. I think that it's really important to make sure you have really solid referrals that you're giving to them, that you do check in with them. Like in the workbook, I have sort of the last page is like, what's your plan for how to check in with this client? After the intensive is completed, and have a plan, communicate that plan, and follow up that plan. And part of that is going to be the next point, which is help the client find additional treatment or resources. So if they don't already have a therapist, you want to make sure you are connecting them with a therapist. You want to make sure that they have psychiatric support if they need that. And you, again, with the checking in, you're going to, a few weeks out, maybe a month out, and this is all detailed in the workbook, check in with the client and be like, hey, did you connect with any of those therapists that I mentioned? Or if they're going back to a previous therapist, are you back in therapy with your previous therapist? I think following up with each of those providers, like getting a release and talking to that therapist, talking to the psychiatrist, good continuity of care. And as I always say, great for referrals. And it's quality care, and it is an ethical termination involves this. So doing that as well. Helping the client prepare for their future and their goals. Again, the workbook, amazing here. It's a fantastic resource for a client to take to another provider and say, here, this is what we plan to do. Here's what we did. Here's where I got stuck. Here's what came up. Here's what I think needs more work. The after intensive pages of the workbook help facilitate this process. And the after pages of the workbook, like I've said, also offers guidance for how to check in with an intensive client post-intensive, and when to be sure that they are on track with treatment recommendations, and just to check in about their overall wellness. So, that is their future, that is their goals, and asking them for feedback on how the intensive maybe has furthered this process for them. The next one is solicit and offer feedback. Great opportunity, and you should always do this, to check in with the client, like maybe at the last day, right? And you can even do it at the end of each day to get sort of a ongoing check-in. In fact, that's good, because then you can, adapt as you go along. What could have been improved, what else they need, and certainly do this at the end of the session, at the end of the intensive, maybe other times, like I said, and then after the fact, after the intensive, when you follow up via email, as the workbook kind of details. Client feedback is crucial for you as you continue to refine your approach and your process, and of course, it is ethical. Your clients have the right to share their feedback with you, and we should offer an opportunity for it. We should not be afraid of it, and it's something that we should welcome. The next point is complete agency-specific tasks. Such a social worky way of putting this. The person who did the training is a social worker, and of course, she's talking about like people who don't necessarily work in a solo private practice, right? Whether you're in a group practice or a community agency, there's going to be all sorts of paperwork and documentation and termination that you need to do. But this is also true for you, right? Dot your I's, cross your T's, make sure all of your paperwork and follow-up is complete and accurate. Make sure you're recording in your notes all these steps. Make sure clients have appropriate referrals. Of course, make sure clients are safe. Give them safety resources as needed, all that stuff. That is part of an ethical termination and avoiding abandonment. Final point is a closing ritual. So important and so beautiful, and something that I always talk about that should be part of your intensive, whether it's giving them a plant, kind of taking 5 or 10 minutes for each of you to write down and share a few things that they saw happen during the intensive. You know, having them, you could have a little, like, the worry stones or whatever, some sort of trinket's the wrong word. I don't know, memorial, what's the word I'm looking for? Memento of the experience. I know people who give a little like self-care gift bag, which is super sweet. But all of this creates a sense of closure, creates a sense of completion, creates a sense of I did this and I'm moving on to the next thing. So these are all the steps that are listed in this ethical termination process training that I did. So I just thought it was interesting to think about in the context of an intensive. So I think intensives provide a beautiful framework for ethical client relationship termination that's healthy, right? It's an excellent model for relationships in their own lives, that good, meaningful relationships don't have to last forever. And that these clients will complete their work with you feeling like they've been cared for really well and competently, and that their needs and expectations of treatment have been met, that you're not abandoning anyone, right? So just another argument, in my opinion, for why intensives can be some of the most effective and ethical forms of treatment. So I hope you found some of my thoughts on intensives and ethical termination to be useful. And I hope you finished your CEUs earlier than I did. I made it in under the wire, if you're wondering. Found out I'm still a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Pennsylvania. Maybe next time I won't put myself in this position. Next week, we will be talking to Danique Bernier, LCSW, EMDR therapist, and consultant in training. We were meant to talk this week, but life got in the way. But I am so excited to have her on next week. Don't miss that chat, and I hope you all have a wonderful week. Take care.